My name is Evelyn Carter, and the man lying beside me in bed is not the man I married. At least that's what my gut keeps whispering, though my mind refuses to accept it. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story, because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. The morning light filtered through the curtains in thin pale ribbons catching in the fine dust motes drifting above our bed. I turned my head toward him, my husband Mark, or so I thought. His breathing was steady, his face relaxed in sleep. And yet, there was something off. I'd been married to Mark for 7 years. I knew the curve of his jaw, the slight twitch in his left eyelid when he dreamed, the way his lips parted just before waking. But this morning, the details felt wrong. His hair looked slightly darker than it used to be. The scar above his eyebrow, one he'd told me, came from falling off his bike. As a kid, seemed fainter, as if it had faded overnight. Even the rhythm of his breathing was different, deeper, more controlled. "Stop it, Evelyn," I told myself. "You're tired. You've been grading too many essays. I'm a literature teacher at a private school, and end of term is always exhausting. Sleep deprivation makes the mind play tricks." I rolled out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded into the kitchen. The coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the silence with its low, comforting gurgle. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. People change subtly over the years. Hair darkens or lightens, scars fade, mannerisms evolve. But this felt different. When Mark entered the kitchen 20 minutes later, his hair damp from the shower, he gave me that familiar smile, or rather a smile that was almost familiar. The corners of his mouth lifted in the same way, but his eyes, they didn't crinkle the way they used to. There was no warmth there, just a calculated mimicry of warmth. "Morning, Ev," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. He kissed the top of my head. Not my lips, not my cheek, just the top of my head, as if he were greeting a casual acquaintance. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. I told myself again to stop overthinking. People have bad mornings. Sometimes they're distracted, sometimes distant. But my instincts, the same instincts that had warned me about unfaithful boyfriends, dishonest colleagues, and fake friends, were prickling. It's strange how love can cloud your judgment. I'd always trusted Mark completely. He was attentive, reliable, charming. He remembered anniversaries, brought me tea when I worked late, and claimed to know my coffee order better than I did. But that morning, as I watched him pour milk into his cup, I realized I didn't actually know him in the way I thought I did. I knew the version he had shown me, and something deep inside me whispered that version wasn't real. The first crack appeared later that day. I came home from school earlier than usual. A student meeting had been canceled, and as I unlocked the door, I heard faint movement in the living room. When I stepped inside, Mark was standing there, startled, holding his phone as if I'd caught him mid-sentence. "You're home early," he said a little too quickly. "Meeting got canceled," I replied, my eyes narrowing. He smiled again, that almost perfect smile, and put his phone in his pocket. But his hands, they were trembling slightly. "What were you doing?" I asked lightly, pretending it was just casual conversation. "Just checking the news," he said, his tone clipped. Then he changed the subject entirely, asking what I wanted for dinner. It was nothing, I told myself. People get jumpy for all sorts of reasons. But I'd seen the flicker of unease in his expression, the way he guarded his phone like it was a weapon. That night, lying beside him again, I tried to recall every detail of our life together. Our first date, our wedding day, the trip to Italy. I replayed the moments in my mind like a film reel, searching for signs, inconsistencies. And slowly unease began to creep in, small things I'd overlooked over the years. Times when he'd avoided answering personal questions. Stories from his childhood that didn't quite line up. Old friends of his I'd never met, never even spoken to on the phone. It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything. It wasn't even enough to justify my growing paranoia. but it was enough to keep me awake long after his breathing evened out beside me. And as I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, I made a quiet promise to myself I would find out what was going on, even if it meant unraveling everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The next few days, I tried to ignore the feeling gnawing at me. I buried myself in grading essays, chatting with colleagues in the staff room, even taking a long walk after work to clear my head. But the more I tried to distract myself, the more my mind replayed every tiny detail of that morning: the smile that didn't reach his eyes, the quick movement to hide his phone, the tremor in his hands. Mark had always been composed, almost unnervingly so. Even when we had disagreements, his temper never flared. He'd remain calm, speak in measured tones, and end the conversation with something soothing. At first, I'd found it admirable, a sign of maturity. But now I wondered if it was something else entirely: control. The control of a man who had learned to hide what he didn't want seen. It was a Thursday evening when it happened. I'd just set the table for dinner: roasted chicken, garlic potatoes, and salad, and Mark walked in from the study. His tie was loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. "You won't believe who I heard from today," he said, casually pouring himself a glass of wine. "Who?" I asked, pulling the chicken from the oven. He leaned against the counter. "Remember when I worked at..." He paused, naming a company he'd supposedly been with before we met. "Well, I ran into Alex from those days. He mentioned that trip we took to Seattle in 2010. Man, that was wild." The words sank in slowly. I froze, the oven mitt still gripping the hot pan. "Seattle. In 2010, he didn't notice my voice tighten. "Yeah. We stayed at that little hotel near Pike Place Market, remember? You insisted on trying every coffee shop in walking distance." I set the pan down. "Mark, we didn't meet until 2012. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes: surprise, annoyance, before his expression smoothed over. "Oh," he said, with a quick laugh. "I meant a different trip. Slipped my mind. You know me and dates." But Mark was meticulous about dates. He remembered everyone's birthday, every anniversary, even the day I got my teaching certification. He'd once teased me for forgetting our friend Laura's wedding date, and here he was acting as if he confused an entire trip that happened before we'd even met. I didn't let it go. "Who were you with in Seattle?" He shrugged a little too carelessly. "A bunch of work people. Honestly, I barely remember the details." Which was a lie. Mark never barely remembered anything. We sat down to eat, but my appetite was gone. I watched him across the table, the way he chewed slowly, the way his eyes avoided mine for longer than necessary. He filled the silence with small talk, asking about my students, the weather, anything but the slip he'd just made. Later, after dinner, he offered to wash the dishes. I lingered nearby, pretending to wipe down the counters, my mind replaying the conversation word for word. That flicker in his eyes hadn't been confusion. It had been calculation, the look of someone deciding how much to reveal. When he finally joined me in the living room, the news was playing in the background. A segment about a man arrested for running multiple scams caught my attention. The suspect's face was blurred, but something about his posture made me glance at Mark. He didn't notice. He was too busy scrolling on his phone. "Everything okay?" I asked. He looked up with that almost familiar smile. "Of course." "Why?" "No reason," I lied. But in that moment, the quiet voice in my head got louder. The voice that said, "You're not imagining this. Something is very, very wrong." I decided then that I wouldn't confront him directly, not yet. If he was hiding something, I needed proof. Solid proof. Something he couldn't talk his way out of. And the universe must have been listening, because the next clue came just a few days later, hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to find it. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the rain tapped gently against the windows and the smell of fresh coffee filled the house. Mark had gone out for a quick errand, leaving me alone with a rare stretch of unstructured time. I told myself I'd use it productively, maybe read a novel, or prepare next week's lesson plans, but instead I found myself cleaning. Not the usual surface tidy up, but the kind of deep, meticulous cleaning you do when your mind is restless and needs a distraction. I started in the living room, moving through each corner like I was cataloging the space. By the time I reached Mark's study, I hesitated. I rarely went in there. It was his space, neat, minimal, always smelling faintly of cedar from the cologne he favored. But today, something pulled me inside. The shelves were dusted, the desk spotless, everything in its place. I crouched to wipe the lower cabinet doors, and that's when I noticed it, a thin envelope that had slipped just out of sight behind a stack of old files. I pulled it free. No label, no handwriting, just plain manila. Curiosity prickled through me. I opened it carefully, sliding out a single photograph. My breath caught. It was Mark, unmistakably him, standing in front of a weathered brick building I didn't recognize. He was wearing a dark leather jacket, leaning casually against the wall, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a coffee cup. Around him were three other people, two men and a woman, all dressed warmly, their expressions casual but knowing. I flipped the photo over. There, scrawled in neat handwriting, was a date, March 14th, 2008, 4 years before we met. That alone wouldn't have been strange, except Mark had always claimed he'd spent that year abroad in Asia working remotely. He'd told me countless stories about the crowded markets, the language barrier, the street food he loved. He'd even shown me souvenirs. So what was he doing in what looked like an American city in 2008, with people I'd never seen before? The more I stared, the more the image unsettled me. It wasn't just the location. It was him. Something in his posture, the way he held himself, felt different, looser, less. Mark. And the people around him, I didn't know their faces, but there was an intimacy there, the easy closeness of people who shared secrets. A small, cold thought crept in. Was this even his real name? I tucked the photo back into the envelope, my hands trembling. For a moment, I considered putting it exactly where I'd found it, pretending I hadn't seen it. But my instincts overrode my hesitation. Instead, I slipped it into a book on my own shelf, somewhere I knew he'd never look. When Mark came home later, I forced myself to act normal. He kissed me on the cheek and dropped a small bag of groceries on the counter, chatting about the traffic and the rain. But I watched him differently now. Every gesture, every word, every glance felt like it had another layer, a layer I hadn't seen before, or maybe had been blind to all these years. That night, as he scrolled through his phone in bed, I thought about the date on the photograph again. 2008. A year he'd erased from our shared life narrative, replacing it with a carefully crafted lie. The photo had cracked something open inside me. I knew now that I couldn't just ignore my suspicions. If there was one lie this big, there could be more. And whatever the truth was, it had been hidden long before I entered the picture. The question was, how deep did the lies go? The answer began to surface sooner than I expected, whispered in the dark when he thought I wasn't listening. It happened on a Tuesday night. The kind of night that drapes itself over the world like a heavy blanket, quiet, unbroken, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Mark had gone to bed early, claiming he had a headache. I stayed up in the living room with a cup of chamomile tea, grading a stack of essays from my seniors. The rain outside was steady, a soft percussion against the windows lulling me into a rhythm. Around midnight, I finally decided to turn in. I gathered my papers, rinsed my mug, and began to climb the stairs. Halfway up, I paused. There was a sound. Faint but unmistakable, the low murmur of a voice. It was coming from our bedroom. At first I thought maybe Mark was talking in his sleep. He'd done that before, little incoherent mumbles that never made sense. But this was different. The cadence was too deliberate, the pauses too measured. He was awake. I crept up the rest of the stairs, my footsteps slow, careful. The door to our bedroom was ajar, just enough for me to see the sliver of light spilling from the lamp on his side of the bed. I edged closer, my pulse quickening. Then I heard it clearly. No, she doesn't suspect a thing. My breath caught. His tone was sharper than I'd ever heard it. No warmth, no softness, just clipped efficiency. And the voice itself. It was his, but altered. Lower, harder, like he'd dropped the friendly mask he wore around me. I told you the papers are almost ready. We just need to. He stopped abruptly, listening to whoever was on the other end. Don't call this number again until I reach out. Understand. There was a pause, then the faint click of the phone being set down. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid he'd hear it. Papers. What papers? And who was he talking to so late at night in that voice, the one that made him sound like a stranger? I didn't move until I heard the lamp switch off. Then the bed creaked, and his breathing shifted into that slow, deliberate rhythm again. Not sleep, I realized, but the practiced stillness of someone pretending to sleep. I slipped into the bathroom instead of the bedroom, turning on the water to mask the sound of my movements. My hands trembled as I brushed my teeth, my reflection in the mirror looking pale and tense. When I finally slid into bed beside him, I could feel it, the awareness radiating from his body. His breathing was controlled too, even. Everything okay? I asked softly. Of course, he murmured, without opening his eyes. But the voice he used now was back to Mark's voice, warm, gentle, the one I knew. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. She doesn't suspect a thing. Except I did. I suspected everything. The next morning, I woke early and found him already downstairs, dressed and sipping coffee. He looked relaxed, scrolling through the news on his tablet as if the night before had never happened. "Morning, Ev," he said with that easy smile. "Sleep well." "Not really," I replied, watching his face carefully. "Too much grating again," he teased lightly. I didn't answer. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him, studying the way his eyes scanned the screen, his fingers tapping idly against the mug. There was no sign of the man I'd overheard, no trace of that cold, unfamiliar voice. But I couldn't unhear it. I decided to test him. "I had the weirdest dream last night," I said casually. "I heard you talking on the phone, saying something about papers." His eyes flicked up for the briefest moment before he smiled. "You and your vivid dreams. Maybe lay off the late-night tea." He said it so effortlessly, so smoothly that someone less determined might have believed him. But I knew what I'd heard. That was when I made another decision. I needed to see what he was hiding in that study. That evening, he left for his weekly basketball game with some coworkers, or so he claimed. As soon as I heard the car pull away, I went to the study. I'd been in there just a few days ago, but this time I wasn't cleaning. I was hunting. The desk drawers were locked as usual. I checked the bookshelves, the cabinets, even inside the printer. Nothing. Then my eyes landed on the lower right drawer of the desk, the one I'd never seen open. The lock was small, the kind that could be picked with a paperclip and a little patience. My hands shook slightly as I worked the clip into the lock, my ear straining for the faint click. When it came, it was almost anticlimactic. Inside, I found neatly stacked folders, all labeled in Mark's handwriting. At first glance, they looked ordinary: bills, bank statements, tax forms, but buried halfway down was a manila folder with no label. I opened it. Inside were 2 driver's licenses. One was the one I knew, Mark Carter, with his current photo and address. The other was a different man entirely. Same face, different name. David Hensley. My stomach turned. There were also several documents with the Hensley name, a rental agreement for an apartment in another city, a car registration, even a library card. All recent, all within the last 3 years. I sat back, the air feeling thick around me. This wasn't just a past identity. He was currently living as 2 different people. I quickly took photos of everything with my phone, my hands slick with sweat. Then I placed everything back exactly as I'd found it, relocking the drawer. By the time I heard his car in the driveway, I was in the kitchen pretending to chop vegetables for dinner. He came in smelling faintly of cologne and cold air, smiling as if nothing in the world was wrong. "How was your evening?" he asked. "Quiet," I said, forcing a smile. Inside my mind was a storm. The phone call, the papers, the second identity. Whatever Mark or David was hiding, it was big. And I was now certain of one thing: the man I'd married was not who he claimed to be. I just didn't know yet how dangerous that truth would turn out to be. I didn't sleep that night. Mark's breathing beside me was steady, rhythmic, the kind of sound that should have been comforting after all these years. But it wasn't. Not anymore. It was the sound of a man who could lie in bed next to me pretending to be my husband while living an entire other life behind my back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the second driver's license, the same face, different name. David Hensley. My mind kept circling the same questions. Who was David? How long had he been living as two people? And more importantly, why? By morning, my exhaustion had calcified into something else: resolve. If I was going to get answers, I couldn't just wait for them to fall into my lap. I needed to be smart. I needed to act like I knew nothing at all. So when Mark came down for breakfast, I smiled. I asked about his game the night before, made a joke about how he always seemed to come home smelling faintly of bourbon, despite claiming to only drink water after playing. He laughed, shaking his head, no hint of suspicion in his eyes. I could do this, I thought. I could wear my own mask just as well as he wore his. For the next few days, I kept my routine perfectly normal. I taught my classes, graded papers, cooked dinner. I didn't go near the study while he was home, but every time he left, I found myself in there again, not to search recklessly, but to observe. And I noticed something odd: that locked drawer wasn't just locked for security, it was checked. Every time I went back, the position of the folder, the way the envelopes were stacked, it was always exactly the same. Too exact. Mark was either paranoid or very, very experienced at hiding things. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the drawer was only one piece of the puzzle. What about his phone, his email, his credit card statements? All the places a second life might leave breadcrumbs. That's when I decided I needed more than just photos of those documents. I needed copies. And for that, I'd need more time than the half-hour gaps when he ran errands. My opportunity came on a Friday evening. Mark mentioned over breakfast that his boss had invited him to a late dinner with some clients. He'd be gone most of the night. I nodded, feigning indifference. "Have fun," I said lightly, as if I didn't care one bit about his comings and goings. Inside, my mind was already mapping out the evening. The moment his car turned the corner, I moved. I unlocked the drawer with the same paperclip trick I'd used before, my fingers steady this time. I pulled out the documents, both driver's licenses, the rental agreement, the car registration, the library card. I placed them in a neat stack and carried them to the scanner I kept in my closet for schoolwork. One by one, I scanned each document into a hidden folder on my laptop, labeling them innocuously as lesson plans and class notes. I knew if Mark ever stumbled across them, I'd need a reason for their existence. When I was done, I returned everything to its exact place. But something in me couldn't stop there. I moved on to his filing cabinet, which wasn't locked. Most of the folders inside were what you'd expect: bills, insurance, paperwork, tax returns. But tucked between two thick files, I found a slim, unmarked envelope. Inside was a single key. It was small brass with no tag to indicate what it opened. I held it in my palm, turning it over, my pulse picking up. I knew I couldn't risk taking it to test every lock in the house while he was gone. If he came home unexpectedly, I'd be caught. But I also knew this key was important. I scanned it, took a photo, and put it back exactly where I'd found it. When Mark finally came home, it was nearly midnight. He smelled faintly of smoke and something expensive. Not bourbon this time, but cologne I didn't recognize. "How was dinner?" I asked from the couch, pretending to be half asleep. "Good," he said, loosening his tie. "Long, but good." He kissed my forehead and went upstairs. I stayed sitting there in the dim light, my mind racing. That key. What could it be for a safe deposit box, a storage unit, another apartment? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my next step wasn't just about finding more evidence, it was about following him. The following week, I started paying closer attention to his schedule. Mark liked routines. He went to the gym every Monday and Thursday, morning basketball on Tuesdays, late work dinners every other Friday. I began to quietly note his departure times, the routes he usually took, the places he claimed to go. It was during one of these gym mornings that I spotted something unusual. I happened to drive past the gym on my way to school, and his car wasn't there. I didn't see him again until that evening when he came home with a gym bag slung over his shoulder, smiling like nothing was out of place. "Good workout?" I asked. "Yeah, felt great," he replied without hesitation. The lie was so smooth it almost made me doubt what I'd seen almost. That night, I made another decision. If I was going to catch him, I couldn't rely on coincidence. I needed certainty. The next time he had a work dinner, I'd follow him. I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't even let him see me. I'd just watch record and keep gathering pieces of the puzzle until I had enough to understand who I was really married to. But as it turned out, I wouldn't have to wait long for the next crack in his facade. Because 3 days later, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, my phone rang, and the woman on the other end would change everything I thought I knew about my husband. The call came on a Wednesday, just as my last class was ending. I was erasing the whiteboard when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The number was unfamiliar, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, until I remembered that the last time I ignored an unknown number, it turned out to be a parent calling about a student emergency. "Hello," I answered, tucking the phone against my ear as my students filed out. For a moment there was silence. Then a woman's voice, low, cautious. "Is this Evelyn Carter?" "Yes." "Who's this?" Pause. "We've never met, but you don't know me and I shouldn't be calling you. It's about your husband." My stomach tightened. "Mark." Another pause. "That's what he calls himself now, isn't it?" I froze, my fingers tightening around the marker still in my hand. "I'm sorry, who is this? I can't talk on the phone. Not where I am. Just." Her voice cracked slightly. "You need to look into the name David Hensley, and you need to be careful. He's not who you think he is." Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. I stood there staring at my phone, the classroom suddenly too quiet. My pulse hammered in my ears. That evening, I didn't mention the call to Mark. Instead, I sat through dinner nodding at his stories about a difficult client, pretending to laugh at his dry humor. But inside, my mind was racing. The woman's voice had been urgent, almost desperate. She hadn't asked if I knew about David Hensley, she'd assumed I didn't. And the fact that she knew my name meant this wasn't some random crank call. I decided my next step was to dig into David Hensley's past. The following Saturday, Mark told me he had errands to run in the city. As soon as he was gone, I grabbed my laptop and started searching. At first, there wasn't much, a few public records, some unrelated LinkedIn profiles. But then I hit on something, a digital archive of a small-town newspaper. The headline was from 2016, "Local businessman vanishes, leaves investors empty-handed." The photo that accompanied the article made my stomach lurch. It was Mark. Or rather, David Hensley. Same sharp jawline, same eyes. But in the picture, he looked different, younger, cockier, with a smirk that was anything but warm. The article painted him as a charming entrepreneur who'd convinced half the town to invest in a can't-miss real estate project. Then one day, he was gone. So was the money. I read every word, my hands growing cold. There were quotes from furious investors, from police investigators, even from a woman identified as his former fiancé. The fiancé's name jumped out at me, Claire Morton. I typed it into the search bar. And there she was in an old photo from a charity gala, standing next to David, her arm looped through his, smiling for the camera, like she was proud to be on his arm. Something told me Claire was the woman who'd called me. I spent the next hour piecing together what I could. There were whispers of similar incidents in other towns, different names, same story. A man matching Mark's description would appear, charm his way into business deals, then vanish. Each time, the paper trail was just clean enough that police couldn't tie him definitively to the crimes. By the time Mark came home, I'd hidden my laptop under a pile of papers and forced my breathing to slow. "How were errands?" I asked as he set down his keys. "Fine," he said with a smile. "Got everything done." I noticed something then, a small fleck of mud on the cuff of his pants. It hadn't rained in the city for days, but the rural outskirts had been soaked the night before. I didn't ask where he'd really been. Not yet. The next day, I made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. I was going to his old hometown. I told him I had a professional development workshop for teachers, one that would keep me overnight. He nodded, seemingly unconcerned, and even offered to drive me, which I declined, claiming I'd carpool with a colleague. The drive was long, the highway stretching into rolling farmland. As I approached the small town, I noticed its quiet charm: brick storefronts, a diner on the corner, a faded welcome sign. I went straight to the local library, figuring it would have old newspaper archives. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, seemed curious when I asked about David Hensley. "You knew David?" she asked. "Sort of," I said carefully. "We met years ago." She shook her head. "He was trouble. Charming, sure, but trouble. Left a lot of people hurting when he skipped town." She leaned in a little. "If you're smart, you'll stay far away from him." I asked if she knew Claire Morton, and the librarian's eyes softened. "That poor girl. She was going to marry him, you know. Never got her money back. Moved away, not long after." I thanked her and spent another hour combing through physical newspaper clippings. Each one painted a clearer picture. David Hensley was a con man, a skilled, calculating one. Before leaving town, I stopped at the diner for a coffee. That's when it happened. A woman slid into the booth across from me without asking. She had auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail, a weathered leather jacket, and eyes that scanned the room before settling on me. "You're Evelyn," she said. It was her, Claire Morton. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then she spoke, her voice low. "You're with him now. I can see it in your face. I can see what it's doing to you." I swallowed hard. "Why did you call me?" "Because I know what he's capable of," she said flatly. "Because I know what it's like to wake up one day and realize the man you love is a stranger. And because if you don't get away, you won't just lose your money. You'll lose yourself." I leaned forward. "What is he planning now?" Her eyes flicked to the window, watching a pickup truck rumble past. "I don't know exactly. But if he's with you, it means you have something he wants. He doesn't do anything without a payoff." She reached into her jacket and slid something across the table, a flash drive. "I started collecting evidence after he left me. I couldn't get the police to act, not enough to pin him down. But maybe you can do something with it." I stared at the small, innocuous object. It felt heavier than it should have. Claire stood. "Don't call me. Don't try to find me. And for God's sake, don't tell him you've spoken to me." Then she was gone, leaving her coffee untouched. I drove home in silence, the flash drive burning a hole in my bag. When I walked through the door, Mark was in the kitchen, smiling as if nothing had changed. "How was the workshop?" "It was enlightening," I said, forcing a smile of my own. And as I stood there, I realized that the game between us had shifted. He didn't know it yet, but I was no longer just his unsuspecting wife. I was his shadow. For the next 2 days, I kept the flash drive hidden at the bottom of my handbag, buried under receipts and loose change. I told myself I'd look at it when I had a quiet hour alone, but every time I reached for it, I hesitated. I knew that once I plugged it in, there would be no going back. Mark moved through the house as if nothing had changed. He kissed my cheek in the mornings, sent quick text updates during the day, and lounged on the couch in the evenings with the news murmuring in the background. But I watched him differently now. Every casual glance at his phone, every unplanned errand, every vague story about his day, I cataloged them all. By Friday, the tension under my skin was unbearable. I left school early, telling the secretary I had a migraine, but instead of going home, I stopped at a small cafe a few blocks away. It was the kind of place with chipped wooden tables and the faint smell of cinnamon in the air, quiet enough to think, but busy enough to be anonymous. I ordered a latte and sat near the back, the flash drive heavy in my pocket. I was halfway through my first sip when I noticed her. She was standing at the counter ordering tea, her eyes flicking briefly around the room. When her gaze passed over me, she froze, and then she walked straight toward my table. "Evelyn Carter?" she asked. I looked up sharply. "Yes." She slid into the chair across from me without waiting for an invitation. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid and a faint scar along her jawline. Her coat was plain but expensive, the kind of thing you only notice if you're paying attention. "You don't know me?" she said, her voice low but urgent. "But I know you, and I know him." The cafe noises faded into a distant hum. "Mark." She gave a bitter half-smile. "Is that what he's calling himself these days?" My throat tightened. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter," she said, glancing toward the door. "What matters is that you get away from him. Now. Before it's too late." I leaned forward, my hands tightening around my coffee cup. "Why? What has he done?" "More than you can imagine," she said. "And he's not finished. If you're with him, it means you're part of whatever game he's playing right now, whether you know it or not." I felt my pulse in my fingertips. "How do you know him?" Her eyes softened for just a moment. "Let's just say, I used to be where you are. I thought I was in love with him. I thought he was the answer to everything I wanted. And then I found out the truth." I searched her face for any sign of deceit, but all I saw was something raw and exhausted, like she'd been carrying this weight for too long. "What truth?" I asked quietly. She glanced around again, lowering her voice even further. "He's not who he says he is. Not to you, not to anyone. Every name, every story, it's all a mask. And when he's done with you, he'll vanish, along with whatever he came for." I swallowed hard. "What does he want from me?" "That," she said, pointing at my left hand, "is the question you need to answer before he takes it from you." Her gaze lingered on my wedding ring. "Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's information. Sometimes it's access to something only you can give him. But it's always about him. Never about you." I felt a cold weight in my chest. "Why are you telling me this?" Her expression hardened. "Because no one warned me. And I lost everything." Before I could respond, she stood abruptly. "Don't tell him we spoke. Don't try to confront him. Just watch. And when you see the opening, get out." She was gone before I could even ask her name. I sat there for a long time, my latte cooling in front of me, my mind replaying every word she'd said. There was something about her urgency, the way she scanned the room, the way she kept her voice low, that told me she wasn't exaggerating. When I finally left the cafe, the late afternoon light was fading and the street lamps were beginning to hum. I drove home in silence, my thoughts a tight knot in my chest. Mark was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables for dinner. "Hey," he said with a smile. "How was your day?" "Fine," I replied, hanging up my coat. "Stop for coffee on the way home." He nodded, turning back to the cutting board. "Good. You need to relax more." The irony of that almost made me laugh. Relax, while sitting across from a man who might not even be who he claimed to be. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I sat in my study with the flash drive on the desk in front of me. The conversation with the cafe stranger had pushed me over the edge. I needed to know what was on it. I plugged it into my laptop. There were 3 folders. The first was labeled Contracts. Inside were scanned copies of documents, business agreements, rental leases, bank forms, all signed under different names. David Hensley, Michael Corman, Alan Price. The photos were always the same man, Mark. The second folder was labeled Correspondence. It contained hundreds of emails, many of them between Mark under one of his aliases, and various partners discussing money transfers, property deals, and coded references to deliverables and deadlines. The third folder made my stomach twist. It was labeled Victims. Inside were subfolders, each one with a name: Claire Morton, Janice Reed, Peter Daniels. I clicked on Claire's first. There were photos, candid ones, clearly taken without her knowing, and copies of financial records showing withdrawals from her accounts. I clicked through more names. Each folder told the same story. Mark, or whatever name he was using, would enter their lives, gain their trust, and then strip away everything of value before disappearing. By the time I finished, it was nearly 3 a.m. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was a pattern, a calculated, methodical destruction of lives. And now I was in the middle of it. The next morning, I could barely look at him. He noticed, of course. "You okay?" he asked as we sat at the breakfast table. "Just tired," I said. He studied me for a long moment before smiling, that easy, practiced smile. "You work too hard." I didn't respond. I just watched him, the way his fingers tapped lightly against his mug, the way his eyes held mine just a second too long, as if daring me to challenge him. But I wasn't going to challenge him. Not yet. I was going to wait. Watch. And when the moment came, I'd be ready to take everything he thought he had control over. By the time a week had passed, the weight of what I knew was starting to press down on me like a constant, invisible hand at the back of my neck. The flash drive sat hidden in a hollowed-out book on my office shelf, but the knowledge it contained never left my mind. Every time Mark brushed my shoulder, every time he called me Ev in that easy tone, every time his phone buzzed and he stepped into another room to answer it, I thought about the emails, the contracts, the victims' names. I told myself I wouldn't confront him until I had a full plan, but self-control is a slippery thing. The more I watched him glide through our life like nothing was wrong, the more I wanted to rip that mask off his face and see who was really behind it. The moment came on a Sunday evening, though. I can't say I planned it. We were sitting in the living room, the rain pattering against the windows, a muted crime drama flickering on the TV. Mark was scrolling on his phone, only half watching the show. I muted the TV. He looked up. "What's up?" I didn't dance around it. "Who is David Hensley?" The change in his expression was almost imperceptible. A flicker in the eyes, a momentary stillness in his hands before his smile returned. "Excuse me, you heard me?" I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "Who is David Hensley? And why is your face on his driver's license?" He leaned back, slowly placing his phone on the coffee table. "Ev, where on earth did you get that idea?" "I found it," I said, not bothering to explain where. "I found the license, the rental agreement, the car registration, all with his name, all with your face." Mark chuckled, actually chuckled, and shook his head. "You've really let your imagination run wild lately." "I'm not imagining anything." My voice sharpened. "I know you've been living as two people. I know you've been lying to me for years." For a moment his face went utterly blank. No smile, no warmth, just an empty, calculating stare. And then, as quickly as it had vanished, the mask slid back into place. "Ev," he said gently, as if speaking to a child, "I think all this stress from work is getting to you. You've been tired, forgetful. You even told me the other day you dreamed I was making phone calls in the middle of the night. Maybe. You're mixing up dreams and reality." I clenched my hands in my lap. "Don't you dare gaslight me." His brows lifted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Gaslight you, Ev? I'm just worried about you. You've been on edge, and now you're accusing me of what, being some criminal with a fake name. That's exactly what I'm accusing you of." He studied me for a long moment, the silence stretching thin. Then he leaned forward, his voice low, smooth, and threaded with something that made my skin crawl. "Do you know what happens when people start making accusations without proof?" he asked. "They make themselves look foolish, unstable, and if they're not careful, people stop believing anything they say." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it landed like one. I forced myself to hold his gaze. "I'm not afraid of you." That faint smile deepened. "Good. You shouldn't be. Because I'm not your enemy, Ev. I'm your husband. And I'm telling you this. Obsession you're developing, it's going to hurt you more than it hurts me." I wanted to scream, to throw the flash drive in his face, to make him admit everything. But something in his eyes told me I wouldn't get what I wanted. Not now. Not like this. If anything, I'd just given him a warning shot, told him I was onto him. And that was dangerous. The days after that conversation were different. Mark didn't bring up David Hensley again, but I could feel a subtle shift in his behavior. He checked his phone more often. He closed the study door when he worked. He started asking me more questions about my schedule, where I was going, who I'd be with, when I'd be home. I answered casually, pretending nothing had changed, but inside I knew exactly what he was doing. He was taking my measure, testing whether I was a threat. I had to be careful now. One afternoon, I left school early and decided to swing by the small self-storage facility near the edge of town. It was a long shot, but I wanted to see if the mysterious brass key I'd found might match any of the units there. I walked through the rows of storage doors, the metallic scent of rain on steel filling the air. I didn't try the key, that would have been too obvious if anyone was watching, but I memorized the locks, the types, the numbers. If the key matched one of these, I'd find a way to confirm it later. As I was leaving, my phone buzzed. A text from Mark. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen for a second before replying. "Grading papers at school." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No response. That night, he was quieter than usual. Over dinner, he asked about my day, but his tone was casual, to the point of emptiness, like he was just going through the motions. When I told him about a student's funny essay topic, he smiled faintly but didn't laugh. We cleaned up in silence. And later, when I passed by the study, I saw the light spilling under the door and heard the faint clack of a keyboard. I paused, listening. "Yes, I think she suspects." "No, not yet. I'll handle it." My stomach turned. I stepped into the bedroom before he could catch me listening. That night, lying in bed with his steady breathing beside me, I realized the truth. My confrontation hadn't rattled him into confession, it had simply made him more careful. If I was going to win this, I couldn't just gather evidence. I had to make him believe I'd given up. I had to lower his guard completely. Which meant the next stage of this would require something I hadn't wanted to do, pretending to trust him again. And that, I knew, was going to be the hardest act of my life. From the moment I decided to pretend everything was fine, I committed to the role completely. I smiled when he came home. I asked about his day. I let him ramble about sports and work and traffic, as if I were hanging on every word. I even reached for his hand across the couch sometimes, letting my thumb trace lazy circles on his skin. Inside, I was ice. But on the surface, I was the perfect wife. Mark responded to the change almost immediately. He relaxed, the sharpness in his gaze softening. He stopped asking where I was every hour. The study door still closed when he worked, but not as often. And once in a while, he'd leave his phone face up on the counter, not always, but enough to make me wonder if he was testing me to see if I'd take the bait. I didn't touch it. Not yet. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning while he was in the shower. His laptop, usually locked with a password, was sitting open on the kitchen table. A spreadsheet was pulled up, filled with transaction records. I moved quickly, snapping photos with my phone before my brain could catch up to my hands. There were multiple columns, all with different bank names. Some of the accounts were in the name Mark Carter. Others were in the name David Hensley. and two were under names I'd never seen before. The balances weren't huge, nothing that screamed millions, but the pattern was obvious: frequent transfers between accounts, sometimes within hours of each other, and always in amounts just under the reporting threshold. One account in particular caught my eye: a bank in a state we'd never lived in. The name on it was Michael Corman. I remembered that name from the flash drive, one of his other aliases. The most recent deposit had been for $14,800 just 3 days ago. I knew enough about money laundering from reading crime novels and the occasional true crime documentary to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't just a man with a second identity. This was a man moving money, possibly stolen money, across multiple aliases and accounts. The temptation to dig deeper right then was overwhelming, but the sound of the shower shutting off snapped me out of it. I closed the laptop, returned to my coffee, and tried to slow my breathing. Mark walked in, towel draped over his shoulders, smiling like a man who believed the world was exactly as it should be. That afternoon, during my free period at school, I called a friend of mine, Hannah, who worked in a local bank branch. We'd met years ago through a book club, and while we weren't close, I knew she was discreet. "I need to ask you something," I said, keeping my voice low. "Hypothetically, if someone had multiple bank accounts under different names, but all with the same photo ID, would that be possible?" She hesitated. "Hypothetically. Not legally, no. Unless they had legitimate documents for each name, which, well, you'd be surprised how often forgeries slip through." "Why, just curious," I said. She didn't push, but before we hung up, she added, "If you think something illegal is going on, be careful. People who do that kind of thing don't take kindly to being exposed." That night, I tested the waters. While we were eating dinner, I mentioned casually, "Funny thing, the bank called me about some strange transactions on my account today. Turns out it was just a mix-up, but for a second I thought someone had hacked me." Mark didn't look up from his plate. "Banks make mistakes all the time." "Yeah," I said, watching him, "but I can't imagine having to keep track of more than one account. I'd go crazy." He smiled faintly, still not meeting my eyes. "Some people like to keep things separate. Makes it easier." That little slip, "makes it easier," told me more than I think he realized. Easier for what? To hide money, to disappear. The next day, I started tracking his movements more closely. I checked the odometer on his car in the morning and again when he came home. Sometimes there were extra miles that didn't match the story he told. One Thursday, he said he was going to meet a client at a downtown cafe. When he came back, the odometer suggested he'd been at least 20 miles farther than that. That same evening, after he went to bed, I opened the photos I'd taken of his spreadsheet and started mapping the transaction dates against his trips. The pattern was undeniable. Almost every time he traveled outside his normal routine, a deposit or withdrawal happened in one of the alias accounts within 24 hours. I knew then that the accounts were the key. If I could get access to even one of them, I could connect him to the money, and possibly to crimes tied to that money. But I also knew I couldn't do it alone. That Friday, I drove to a neighboring town after school and met with Claire Morton in a quiet park. I'd found her number in one of the flash drive documents. She'd been reluctant to see me again, but I told her I had something she needed to know. When I explained what I'd found, the spreadsheets, the names, the transfers, she nodded grimly. "That's him," she said. "That's how he operates. Keeps just enough in each account to avoid attention, moves it constantly, so nothing ever sits still long enough to be traced." "Can you help me get into one of them?" I asked. Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because if I can connect the money to him, maybe I can stop him." Claire was silent for a long moment, then finally said, "I can't touch the accounts without risking myself, but I might know someone who can." When I got home that night, Mark was in an unusually good mood. He'd ordered takeout, poured us both glasses of wine, and even suggested we watch one of my favorite movies. It was almost convincing, almost enough to make me forget that an hour earlier I'd been sitting across from the woman he'd nearly destroyed, plotting how to bring him down. As we sat there on the couch, my head resting lightly against his shoulder, I thought about the accounts again. Somewhere out there, my husband had a financial trail that could unravel everything. And if I played my part well enough, he'd never see me coming. The following week, Claire called me from a number I didn't recognize. "Meet me?" she said. "No greeting, no preamble. There's more you need to know before you get in any deeper." We met at a small roadside diner halfway between our towns. The place was nearly empty save for a trucker nursing a coffee in the corner and a waitress scrolling on her phone by the register. Claire slid into the booth opposite me, her leather jacket damp from the drizzle outside. "You're getting close," she said, leaning forward, her voice low. Too close for comfort. I folded my hands on the table. "I'm already in it. You know that." Her eyes searched mine for a long moment. "Fine. You need the full picture." She took a slow breath as if steadying herself, then began. "When I met him, she said his name was Michael Corman. He was charming, generous, almost too good to be true. I'd just gotten out of a bad relationship, so I didn't see the red flags. He said he worked in private investments, always traveling, always meeting clients. I thought it was glamorous." She gave a humorless laugh. "It wasn't. It was a cover. The clients were Mark's people with money, property, or connections he could use, and once he had what he wanted, they were disposable." Claire's eyes darkened. "With me, it was my inheritance. My parents had left me a sizable amount, and he convinced me to invest it into a development project, said it would double in 2 years. I believed him. I signed papers I didn't read closely enough. And when I finally realized something was wrong, the money was already gone." I felt my stomach twist. "How much, all of it?" she said simply. "And not just the money. He left me with debts, loans he'd taken in my name, forged signatures on documents I didn't even know existed. I had to sell my house to cover part of it. I've been renting ever since." Her voice caught slightly, but she didn't stop. When I confronted him, he didn't get angry. He didn't deny it. He just smiled, like it was all a game. Then he told me I should be grateful that I'd learned a valuable lesson about trust. The words made my skin crawl. I asked her if she'd gone to the police. She nodded. "Of course I did. But he's careful. Every transaction was technically legal. My name was on the documents, my signatures were on the forms, even if they were forged. Without hard proof that he'd falsified them, it was my word against his. And he's very, very good at making people doubt your word." I thought about our confrontation in the living room, how easily he'd tried to twist the narrative and make me question myself. Claire took a sip of her coffee, her hand steady now. "That's his pattern. He studies people. Figures out what they want most: love, security, money, status. And then he becomes the man who can give it to them. He builds the illusion until you can't tell where he ends and the truth begins. And then, when he's done with you, he tears it all down." I swallowed hard. "And you think that's what he's doing to me?" She gave me a look that was almost pitying. "I don't think. I know. The only question is what he's after this time." I told her about the bank accounts, the aliases, the transactions. Her expression tightened. "That's not just his personal stash," she said. "He's moving money for someone else. He's done it before, usually for people who don't want that money traced. Criminal money. If he's using you as part of that operation, you're in more danger than you realize." The words settled over me like ice. Danger, how Claire leaned in closer. "If he thinks you're on to him, he'll make sure you're discredited before you can do anything. And if that doesn't work, he'll make you disappear from his life in a way you can't come back from. Financially, socially, sometimes worse." I held her gaze. "Then how do I stop him?" She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. It was worn, the cover creased from years of use. This is everything I've tracked since I got out. Names, dates, transactions, aliases. It's not enough for the police on its own, but it's enough to start connecting the dots. If you're going to take him down, you'll need to be smarter than he is. And you'll need to make him think he's winning. I took the notebook, carefully feeling the weight of it in my hands. Why are you giving this to me? Claire's eyes softened for the first time. Because I know what it's like to lie awake at night wondering who you married. And because if you don't get ahead of him now, you won't get the chance later. We talked for another hour, going over the names and accounts in her notes. Some I recognized from the flash drive. Others were new. There was one in particular, a woman named Janice Reed, who had vanished from her social circles after being involved with one of his aliases. Vanished, I asked. Claire nodded grimly. She moved across the country, changed her name. I tracked her down once, but she wouldn't talk about him. Just said she didn't want to ever hear his voice again. By the time we left the diner, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. Claire squeezed my hand before we parted. Be careful, Evelyn. He's not the man you think you know. And the more you act like nothing's wrong, the more he'll let his guard down. Driving home, I felt the dual pull of fear and determination. Claire's story was like looking into a mirror that showed my possible future, one I was determined not to repeat. When I walked through the front door, Mark was in the kitchen slicing lemons for a drink. He glanced up and smiled. Hey, there you are. How was your day? I matched his smile. Productive. I set my bag down, careful to keep my body between him and the small notebook now tucked into the inner pocket of my coat. As we sat down to dinner, I found myself watching him again, but this time with a new perspective. Claire had been right. Every movement, every word, every smile was calculated. But now I had my own calculations to make. If I was going to win this game, I'd need more than evidence. I'd need timing. I'd need to know exactly when to strike and how to make sure he couldn't recover. And for that, I was going to need him to believe with absolute certainty that I was still in love with him. The next morning, I woke before Mark and lay there in the gray half-light staring at the ceiling. Claire's notebook sat hidden in my handbag on the chair by the window. I'd skimmed through it again before bed, my eyes catching on names, cities, and dates that spanned more than a decade. Each entry was like a breadcrumb leading back to him, or rather to the many men he'd been. Mark stirred beside me, rolling toward me with a soft murmur. Morning, he said, his voice warm and lazy. I smiled faintly. Morning. The smile was part of my act now. Every touch, every shared look, every word that suggested things were normal, all carefully measured to keep him comfortable. Because if I'd learned anything from Claire, it was that the moment he sensed real danger, he'd disappear. And I needed him here, thinking he still had the upper hand. After he left for work, I brewed coffee, set my laptop on the kitchen table, and opened both Claire's notebook and the folder of flash drive documents. I began the painstaking process of cross-referencing. David Hensley appeared in multiple bank transactions from 2016 to 2018, matching the newspaper article I'd found. Michael Corman overlapped with a series of property sales in 2014. Alan Price, a new name to me, was linked to a consulting firm dissolved in 2012 after financial irregularities. It was all there, the aliases, the accounts, the movements. But what I needed was a direct, undeniable link between each name and the man sitting across from me at dinner every night. I started small. That afternoon, I drove to a courthouse 2 towns over where public property and business records were stored. Under the guise of doing research for a school project, I asked to see archived deeds and filings. In the records for 2014, I found a notarized property transfer from Michael Corman to another shell company. The signature was his. The notary stamp was real. And the driver's license number listed, it matched the one on his Mark Carter ID, the one in my wallet in a photocopy. It was the first concrete overlap. Over the next week, I found more. A rental application signed by David Hensley listed a phone number one I recognized instantly as the number Mark had before we moved in together. A business permit for Alan Price used our current home address for mailing. Piece by piece, the web was becoming visible. At night, I'd sit next to him on the couch, leaning against him while my mind churned with data and connections. He'd talk about his day, complain about a colleague, or scroll through his phone completely unaware that I was tracing the skeleton of his real life under the skin of the one he showed me. One evening, I decided to push just a little, not enough to spook him, but enough to test his reaction. "You ever wish you could just start over?" I asked as we sat at the dinner table. He looked up from his plate. "Start over how? You know. New city, new job, new name. Just reinvent yourself completely." There was the briefest pause before he smiled. "Sounds exhausting." "Why, just wondering," I said, keeping my tone light. "Sometimes I think about it. How different life could be if you weren't tied to who you've always been." His eyes lingered on mine for a moment, and then he nodded slowly. "I guess it depends on what you're running from." That night, I wrote those exact words in the margin of Claire's notebook. "Depends on what you're running from." Because I knew now that he wasn't just running, he was cycling. One identity to the next, never staying long enough to let the past catch up. And I was in the middle of his current chapter. The turning point came 2 days later. I was in the study while he was at the gym scanning through a stack of old mail he'd left in a desk drawer. Most of it was junk, but tucked between two credit card offers was a bank statement addressed to Michael Corman. The balance was modest, but the recent transactions included a deposit from a name I didn't recognize, J. Reed Holdings. My stomach clenched. Janice Reed. The woman Claire had said vanished. If I could connect her disappearance to money landing in one of his accounts, I'd have more than just a paper trail of fake names. I'd have a trail of victims. That evening, I made a point of being warmer than usual, laughing at his jokes, leaning into him on the couch. I even suggested we plan a weekend getaway, something to spend more time together. He seemed genuinely pleased, which told me two things: first, that my act was working, and second, that he was starting to believe I'd dropped whatever suspicions I'd had. But behind the scenes, I was moving faster. I contacted a friend from my university days, a tech consultant named Ryan, who owed me a favor. I told him I was doing background research on someone and sent him the bank account details from the statement, asking if he could quietly see if any other accounts or transfers linked back to it. Ryan didn't ask questions. "Give me a week," he said. A week felt like a lifetime, but I knew I couldn't push. In the meantime, I kept building my own case. I scanned every document I found, labeled them by alias, and stored them in a hidden cloud folder. If anything happened to me, I wanted someone else to be able to see the full picture. I also started writing a narrative, not just dates and numbers, but the story of how I met him, the discrepancies I'd noticed, the photo from 2008, the phone calls at night, the confrontation. I wanted to make sure that if the time came, I could present a coherent, undeniable truth. One night, as I sat at the kitchen table working on it, Mark came in and set a glass of wine beside me. "What are you working on?" he asked casually. "Just lesson plans," I said, sliding a piece of paper over the notebook I'd been writing in. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. "You work too much, Ev. You should let yourself relax." "I'll relax when I can," I replied with a smile of my own. Inside, I thought, "I'll relax when you're gone." The web was tightening now. I could feel it. He didn't know it yet, but every day I was moving closer to the point where his carefully constructed world would collapse, not because I confronted him in anger, but because I'd dismantled it piece by piece until there was nowhere left for him to hide. And when that day came, I wouldn't just be taking my life back. I'd be making sure he could never do this to anyone else again. By the time Ryan called me back, I'd almost convinced myself the trail would go cold. But his first words told me otherwise. "You weren't kidding," he said. "That account you gave me, it's connected to at least 4 others in different states." 2 under the same alias. You gave me Michael Corman and the others under different names. All of them have transfers between each other, and all of them have recent deposits from shell companies. This is serious, Evelyn. What are you into? I swallowed hard. I can't explain yet, but I need you to save every detail. Every transfer, every linked account. Keep it secure. He hesitated. Are you in trouble? Yes, I said simply. But if this works, I won't be for long. The trouble was, information wasn't enough. If I handed what I had to the police now, there was a chance it wouldn't stick. Mark or David or Michael or whoever he decided to be next had survived investigations before. Claire had warned me unless the evidence was airtight and tied to a recent provable crime, he'd walk away clean. So I had to be patient. I had to let him get comfortable enough to make a mistake in front of me, or better yet, involve me in something I could document without a shred of doubt. It was a dangerous plan. It meant walking a thin line between proximity and exposure, all while convincing him I was exactly where I wanted to be, in his arms, in his life, and in the dark. I doubled down on the act. I left little notes in his briefcase wishing him luck on big meetings. I asked about his clients with genuine-sounding curiosity, listening without judgment as he told vague, evasive stories. I even initiated intimacy more often, not because I wanted it, but because it reinforced the illusion that nothing was wrong. And it worked. Within a week, his guard was lower than it had been since the confrontation that backfired. He started leaving his laptop open more often, even walking away from it while logged in. His phone still stayed close, but not glued to him like before. One night while he was in the shower, I glanced at his email, just a quick scan. Nothing that would leave a trace. That's when I saw the message. The subject line read, "Contract Final Steps." The body was "Short transfer on Monday. Meet at location as discussed. Bring her." There was no signature, no name, just a burner email address. But the two words "bring her" made my skin prickle. Her. Me. I took a quick photo with my phone and closed the screen before he came out. Over the next 2 days, I acted like nothing had happened. I packed his lunches, laughed at his dry humor, even suggested we go for a walk together after dinner. Inside, I was racing to figure out what Monday meant and what role I was about to play in his next move. I reached out to Claire again, meeting her in a grocery store parking lot where no one would notice us talking. When I showed her the email, she swore under her breath. If he's bringing you, it's because you're the leverage. Or the cover. Either way, it means the transaction is big enough that he needs someone else to legitimize it. Which means, I said slowly, if I'm there, I can document everything. Claire looked uneasy. Yes. But it also means if something goes wrong, you'll be the one holding the bag. I met her eyes. That's why I'll have someone watching. I called Ryan that night from my car parked a block from the house. I need a favor, I said. On Monday, I need you nearby. Quiet. Recording. He didn't like it, but he agreed. Text me the location as soon as you know. And Evelyn, be careful. Monday came faster than I expected. Over breakfast, Mark was unusually upbeat. I've got an important meeting today, he said, buttering his toast. Want to come along? Might be nice to make a day of it afterward. I smiled warmly as if the idea were a surprise. Sure, sounds fun. Inside, my nerves were tight as piano wire. The meeting was in an office park 2 towns over, the kind of bland beige complex where businesses without storefronts operate. The lobby was empty except for a bored-looking receptionist who waved us toward a conference room. Inside, 3 men were already seated at the table. They barely glanced at me before focusing on Mark. No one introduced themselves. The conversation was quick, businesslike. Papers slid across the table. One of the men handed Mark a folder thick with documents which he skimmed before signing with a name I'd never seen before: Daniel Price. I kept my face neutral, but my heart pounded. Another alias, another connection. When the papers were signed, a small metal case was set on the table. Mark opened it just enough for me to see stacks of neatly bound $100 bills. He closed it again quickly. "Pleasure doing business," one of the men said. Mark smiled, shaking hands. "Likewise." I glanced at my watch. I knew Ryan would be outside recording. I also knew the camera on my phone hidden in my purse had been running since we walked in. When we left, Mark's mood was buoyant. He suggested lunch in the city, chatting easily as if we'd just attended a routine meeting. I played along, laughing in the right places, asking casual questions that he answered with vague charm. But the truth was, I already had what I needed: video of him taking possession of that case, audio of him signing as Daniel Price, and the timestamp to match Ryan's recording of us entering and leaving the building. That night, after he fell asleep, I slipped into the study and transferred the video files to my hidden cloud folder alongside the photos of the bank accounts and the aliases. The folder was nearly complete now, a meticulous archive of his double life built piece by piece, while he thought I was still his adoring wife. All that was left was the final move. I knew from Claire's notes that after a big transaction he usually disappeared within a month. If I didn't act before then, he'd be gone with the money, the evidence, and any chance of holding him accountable. Which meant I had weeks at most. Weeks to set the trap so tightly that when it snapped, there'd be no way out. At breakfast the next morning, Mark poured my coffee and kissed the top of my head. "I was thinking," he said casually, "we should take a trip. Somewhere warm. Just us." I smiled back, the perfect picture of a devoted wife. "That sounds wonderful." Inside, I was already counting the days, because the game was almost over. And for the first time, I was certain I was going to win. In the days after that Monday meeting, I felt a shift in the air between us. Mark was looser, almost buoyant, like a man who'd just pulled off something significant. He whistled while making coffee, lingered in the doorway when I was working, kissed me more often than usual. To anyone else, it would have looked like a marriage in its sweetest phase, but to me, it was a sign that he thought he'd already won. That arrogance was exactly what I needed. I began my plan quietly, without a single move that could tip him off. It started with spontaneous suggestions: brunch at a new restaurant, a scenic drive, visiting an art exhibit in the city. Each outing had a purpose: to get him comfortable with me, taking photos of us together, sometimes with my phone angled just enough to capture things in the background: license plates, building signs, timestamps. I needed images that placed him in real time in locations tied to his aliases and transactions. Next, I called Ryan. "It's almost time," I said. "But I'll need one more setup, this time with audio and video. Discreet but close enough that no one can question who's in the footage." He hesitated. "Evelyn, you're sure about this? Because once you pull it, there's no going back." "I know," I said. "And that's the point." The opportunity came 2 weeks later, delivered by Mark himself. Over dinner one night, he casually mentioned a small errand he needed to run on Friday. "Thought you could come with me," he said, pouring more wine. "It's just signing some documents, quick in and out. Then we could drive up the coast for the weekend." I smiled, like it was the most romantic suggestion I'd ever heard. I'd love that. Inside, my pulse quickened. Signing documents. If this was anything like the Monday meeting, there would be witnesses' signatures, maybe even money changing hands. All I had to do was make sure the right people saw it. Friday morning, I texted Ryan the details. He replied with a single thumbs up emoji, our agreed signal that everything was set. Mark picked me up at 10 a.m., wearing his favorite tailored blazer and that easy, confident smile. He kept up light conversation during the drive, talking about the weather and a new restaurant he wanted to try. Not once did he hint at where we were actually going. We pulled into a nondescript office building with mirrored windows. A man in a gray suit was waiting just inside, greeting Mark warmly before ushering us into a small conference room. On the table were 2 thick folders and a sleek black briefcase. The meeting was efficient. Mark flipped through the documents with practiced ease, signing page after page, not as Mark Carter, but as Alan Price. I kept my face neutral, glancing occasionally at the men in the room as though bored. At one point, Mark gestured for me to initial a line. "Just a formality," he murmured. I hesitated, then smiled and signed my hand steady even as my heart pounded. The initials were small, but they placed me at the scene, a witness, a participant. And that meant my testimony could carry weight if it came to court. When the papers were done, the man in the gray suit slid the black briefcase toward Mark. He opened it just enough for me to see neat stacks of cash inside, then snapped it shut again. "Pleasure doing business," the man said. Mark shook his hand. "Always." What Mark didn't know was that Ryan's camera had captured the entire exchange from across the street through a long lens, while a small directional microphone had picked up enough of the conversation to match the footage. Between that and my own purse camera, the meeting was preserved from multiple angles. We left the building and began the drive up the coast. Mark was in a good mood, talking about seafood dinners and ocean views. I nodded, smiled, played the part. But inside, I was already thinking about the next step. That night, in the quiet of a rented beachside inn, I excused myself to take a bath and locked the door. I pulled out my phone and uploaded every file, the video, the audio, the photos, to my hidden cloud folder. Then I sent a duplicate copy to a secure drive Ryan had set up just in case. When I emerged from the bathroom, Mark was lounging on the bed watching the news. He glanced at me, smiling lazily. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," I said, slipping into bed beside him. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a lie. Over the next few days, I quietly consolidated everything I'd collected, aliases, at least 4 each, tied to specific transactions. Bank accounts documented with statements, transfers, and linked shell companies. Witness accounts from Claire, plus corroborating names from the flash drive. Video and audio evidence. 2 meetings with cash exchanges, signed documents under false names, and my own presence as a witness. It was enough. More than enough. Now I just had to choose where to drop the net and who would be standing there to catch him. Claire wanted me to go straight to the FBI. "Local police will get eaten alive if he has the right lawyers," she said when we met for coffee. "Federal agents will at least have the resources to follow the money trail." Ryan agreed. "And they can coordinate across state lines. That's the only way all his aliases get tied together in one case instead of a dozen little ones he can wriggle out of." I listened, nodded, and made my decision. The following Thursday, I took the day off work and drove 2 hours to the nearest FBI field office. I carried only my handbag and a small encrypted flash drive with the full archive. I didn't tell Mark where I was going. I sat in a plain interview room for nearly 3 hours, speaking with 2 agents who alternated between disbelief and growing interest as I laid everything out. When I finished, I slid the flash drive across the table. "This," I said, "is your case. Every alias, every transaction, every victim I know of. If you need me to testify, I will." They assured me they'd be in touch, and that in the meantime I should go about my life as normally as possible. That night I made dinner for Mark and smiled as he told me about his day. Inside, I knew the countdown had begun. He didn't realize the walls were already closing in. He didn't know that the life he'd so carefully constructed was about to collapse. In a way no new name, no new city, no new identity could fix. And when the moment came, I would be there to watch the mask fall for good. It happened 10 days later on a gray morning that smelled faintly of rain. Mark was in the kitchen sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone when there was a knock at the door. Not the light, polite kind you get from a neighbor. This was firm, deliberate. I glanced at him, expecting someone. He shook his head, setting his mug down as he walked to the front door. The moment he opened it, the world seemed to shift. 2 men in dark suits stood there, their badges held up just high enough for me to see. Behind them, I caught the glint of unmarked sedans idling at the curb. "Mark Carter," one of the agents asked, though his tone said he already knew the answer. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Mark froze, his expression perfectly blank. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," the agent said calmly. You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering, among other charges. You have the right to remain silent." The rest was lost in the sudden chaos. Mark's shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, and for a fraction of a second the mask cracked. The warm, easy husband vanished, and in his place was someone cold and calculating, the man Claire had warned me about. He didn't fight, though. That wasn't his way. He stepped back into the living room, allowing the agents inside his eyes, scanning the space like he was already assessing what story he'd tell. "Evelyn," he said, turning to me with a look of manufactured confusion. "Tell them I can't," I said, my voice steady. Something flickered in his gaze, surprise, then realization. He understood. "You," he said slowly, the warmth gone entirely now. "You did this." I didn't flinch. "I told you I wasn't afraid of you." For the first time since I'd met him, he didn't smile. The agents moved quickly, cuffing his wrists and reading him his rights. One began collecting items from the study, his laptop files, even the locked drawer I'd picked open weeks ago. Another agent photographed the space, cataloging everything. Mark didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on me as though trying to burn a hole through my resolve. "I could have given you everything," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And you threw it away." "No," I said. "You were taking everything. I just stopped you before you finished." They led him out the door. His steps measured, his posture still upright, the walk of a man who refused to look defeated even as his world collapsed. I followed them to the porch, standing just far enough back to watch him being guided into the back of an unmarked sedan. It was raining now, a light drizzle that clung to my hair and skin. Mark turned his head just enough to look at me one last time before the door shut. No smile, no charm. Just a flat, assessing stare, as if he were already calculating what he'd do if he ever got the chance. When the cars pulled away, the silence they left behind felt heavier than the rain. I stood there until the last taillight disappeared around the corner, my breath fogging in the cool air. Inside the house felt different, emptier, but also lighter, as though the air itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. I wandered into the study. The desk drawers were open now, their contents in neat evidence bags. The space smelled faintly of paper and dust, stripped of the control he'd kept over it for so long. On the corner of the desk was a single sheet of paper the agents had left behind for me, a property receipt for the seized items with my name listed as the reporting witness. Seeing it in writing, witness, made something settle in my chest. For months I'd been surviving in his shadow. Now I was standing in the light. That afternoon, Claire called. She didn't bother with hello. "I saw the news," she said. "You did it." "We did it," I corrected. "Without you, I wouldn't have had half of what I needed." There was a long pause, and then she said softly, "You know he won't stop trying, right? In his head, this isn't over." "I know," I said. "But now he's not the only one keeping track." That night, the house was quiet except for the rain against the windows. I made tea, curled up in the armchair, and opened the notebook where I'd been documenting everything. For the first time, I wasn't adding to it. I was closing it. The final page was short. The mask is gone. And so is he. The trial would take months. The evidence was sprawling: multiple aliases, linked accounts, testimony from victims in 3 states. The agents told me my cooperation would be key, but they also warned me men like Mark don't go down quietly. They look for cracks. They exploit them. But as I sat there listening to the rain, I realized something. The fear that had lived in me for months was gone. In its place was a steady, grounded certainty. Whatever came next, I'd face it. And I wouldn't be facing it alone. The morning after Mark's arrest, I woke to sunlight spilling across the bedroom, unfiltered, warm, and startling in its clarity. For months, I'd woken in shadows, my mind already bracing for the careful performance the day would require. But that morning, there was no act to maintain. The other side of the bed was empty. The space felt bigger than it should have, quieter too. And instead of feeling lonely, I felt something else: relief. It wasn't the kind of dramatic tear-streaked relief you see in movies. It was quieter, heavier, like setting down a suitcase you've been carrying so long you forgot what it felt like to stand without it. I spent most of that day in the kitchen sorting through the stacks of paperwork and notes I'd kept hidden for months. Now they weren't weapons to be wielded in secrecy, they were the record of a battle I'd fought and won. Every page told part of the story: the aliases, the bank accounts, the meetings, the coded emails. My own handwriting threaded through it all in the margins, capturing the moments when I'd felt the floor drop beneath me, and the ones when I'd clawed it back. When I'd first started documenting everything, it had been about self-preservation. Somewhere along the way, it became something else: proof that I hadn't imagined it, that the danger was real, that my instincts had been right all along. The FBI had called earlier that morning. They told me Mark was being held without bail, at least until the initial hearing. The evidence was strong, not just mine, but what they'd uncovered after seizing his devices and accessing his accounts. Other victims had already come forward. Claire was one of them. She'd texted me later. "It feels different this time, like he can't wriggle out of it." I hoped she was right. In the weeks that followed, I tried to reclaim parts of my life that had been in limbo. I went back to teaching, to sitting in the staff lounge with colleagues and talking about everything but my personal life. I started cooking for myself again, not the performative meals I used to make for Mark, but simple, comforting dishes that reminded me I was in control of my own home. At night, I read books without wondering what he was doing in the next room. I left my phone on the counter without fear of him scrolling through it. I stopped checking the locks twice before bed. It was a slow process, unlearning the habits of hypervigilance. But every small change felt like a victory. The first time I ran into one of our old acquaintances in town, she gave me a pitying look and said, "I heard about Mark. You must be devastated." I didn't correct her. I didn't explain. I just smiled politely and said, "I'm doing just fine." Because the truth was, I wasn't devastated. I was free. Still, freedom came with its own kind of weight. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I sometimes thought about the man I'd believed I married, the warm smile, the thoughtful gestures, the shared dreams whispered in the dark. And then I'd remember how easily that version of him had disappeared, replaced by the stranger who'd looked me in the eye and told me I was imagining things. The hardest part wasn't accepting that he'd lied to me. It was accepting that I'd loved the lie. One evening, I drove out to the coast. The sun was low, the waves rolling in with a steady rhythm that seemed older than anything I'd been through. I stood on the sand, letting the wind push my hair back, and thought about the months I'd spent living in quiet resistance. The fear, the pretending, the gathering of evidence, all of it had led to this: a wide-open horizon and no one standing between me and it. I realized then that reclaiming my life wasn't just about removing him from it. It was about choosing what came next on my terms. I decided to take a leave of absence from teaching. Not because I couldn't handle the classroom, but because I wanted time, real, unhurried time to breathe. To travel if I wanted, to sit in a cafe with a book all afternoon, to visit friends I hadn't seen in years. The last page of Claire's notebook was still blank. I thought about leaving it that way, a symbolic closure. But one night I picked up a pen and wrote, "Sometimes survival isn't the ending. Sometimes it's the beginning." When people ask now how I found the courage to stand up to him, I tell them the truth. I didn't start out brave. I started out suspicious and then scared. The bravery came later, in small, unremarkable choices: to listen instead of ignore, to watch instead of turn away, to act instead of waiting for someone else to do it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the moment you start trusting your instincts, you stop being the victim of someone else's story and start being the author of your own. The night before Mark's first court date, I slept with the windows open. The air was cool, the sound of crickets steady in the dark. I knew there would be more to come: testimony, cross-examinations, the slow grind of the legal process. But I also knew that whatever happened in that courtroom, he would never again be the man in my house, at my table, in my bed. And that was enough. So here's my final word to anyone who might hear my story. If something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why, pay attention. Look closer. The truth might not be what you want it to be, but knowing it will always be better than living inside someone else's lie. Because the cost of pretending nothing is wrong is far greater than the cost of losing whatever illusion you thought you had. And when the mask finally falls, you'll see that freedom isn't just walking away, it's walking forward without looking back.